Intense fighting continues as Israel has expanded its ground offensive in Gaza. Israeli strikes have now targeted refugee camps. This latest move threatens to derail the ongoing hostage release talks. This as the war is now expanding well beyond Israel's borders. In the latest, Israel has confirmed that 9 of its soldiers were killed during combat operations in Gaza on Tuesday. This brings the total number of Israeli troops killed since the 7th of October to 326. Both Hamas and Israel have engaged in tough battles in the last 24 hours. Israel says its troops have hit anti-tank missile launching cells and observation posts, seizing many guns and explosives and killing dozens of militants on Tuesday, while it has hit 11,000 Gaza terror targets since the war began. Israel attacked a densely populated refugee camp in North Gaza. It's called the Jabalia refugee camp. Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry says at least 50 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli strikes on the camp. Israel Army says it secured a central Hamas stronghold in the refugee camp airstrike. IDF has announced that its fighter jets have eliminated commander of Hamas's Central Jabalia Battalion, who they say was one of the leaders responsible for the deadly attacks on the 7th of October. Moving on to the hostage situation then, the military wing of Hamas says that the group plans to release some non-Israeli hostages that they've been holding in the coming days. In a video statement, the group announced that the release had been arranged through mediation by some nations. Though these nations were not named, Hamas also did not reveal how many hostages would be freed, but said that the group no longer had the desire or the need to keep them. Meanwhile, Qatari Prime Minister has told visiting Thailand Foreign Minister that efforts are on to secure the release of hostages. However, after the Israeli strike on Gaza's refugee camp, Qatar has warned that Israeli aggression can undermine the talks on hostage release. On the other hand, the war is expanding beyond borders, as I mentioned. Tensions have been rising on the Israeli border with Lebanon since the war began, as the fighting continues with the militant group Hezbollah. On Tuesday, Lebanon accused Israel of white phosphorus attacks, over which it said it would file a complaint to the United Nations. Elsewhere, Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi rebels said that they attacked Israel on Tuesday. They quote-unquote launched a large batch of ballistic missiles and a large number of armed aircraft were launched at Israel. The Houthi rebels pledged more attacks against Israel if its war on Hamas in Gaza continues. Now, shifting focus to aid situation in Gaza, dozens of Egyptian volunteers at the Rafah crossing facilitated the movement of aid trucks into Gaza on Tuesday. The White House said 66 trucks of humanitarian assistance entered Gaza in the last 24 hours and that dozens more are expected to be cleared for deliveries. The United States acknowledges that level of truck and aid delivery so far is just a fraction of what's actually needed on ground in Gaza. U.S. officials say that they would like to reach up to 100 trucks a day. Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden spoke with Jordan's King Abdullah and both nations agreed that it's critical to ensure that Palestinians are not forcibly displaced outside of Gaza. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who also spoke with the Israeli president via phone and reiterated U.S. support to Israel's right to defend itself. Blinken will begin a new tour to West Asia amid the war on Friday. He will visit Israel and make other stops in the region as well. In other updates, Bolivia, it's now severed ties, all diplomatic ties with Israel as it demands an end to attack in the Gaza Strip. Bolivia has accused Israel of committing crimes against humanity and it's become the first country to sever ties with Israel ever since the war began. And for more on this, our correspondent Susan Tehrani has sent us this report from New York. Listen in.
The White House on Monday agreed with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that a ceasefire would only play into Hamas's hands. However, the Biden administration in recent days has been warming up to a humanitarian pause, mostly to get aid to Gaza, but also because while the majority of Americans support Israel's right to defend itself and also its war against Hamas, there are deep divisions among Democrats on Capitol Hill, not to mention a drop in Biden's poll numbers among Democrat voters. Less than 20% of Democrat voters now say they'll vote for Biden again in 2024 because of his unwavering support for Israel. The Democrats in Congress are now divided into two camps as well, those that are staunch supporters of Israel and those that are on the left and are vocally pro-Palestinian. It's also important to note that the American public, well, as I mentioned, the majority do support America's support for Israel. The American public is also very impatient when it comes to wars and U.S. involvement. While right now that support is there, it's unclear as the war drags on and the casualties on both sides increase how this sentiment may change. Susan Tehrani reporting from New York for WION World is One.
For more on this, we're now being joined by Dr. Malcolm Davis from Canberra, who is a senior defence analyst with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Sir, welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Dr. Davis, we've seen global outrage against Israel. The need to protect civilian lives, that has become a major concern. Israel, however, it seems to have just one goal, and that is to completely annihilate Hamas. How do you think Israel can strike a balance here and ensure that they are also prioritizing the safety of civilians in Gaza?
Well, it's difficult because civilians are co-located with Hamas in Gaza. Now, the Israelis have attempted to warn Palestinian civilians to leave the area for a number of weeks. But part of the problem is that Hamas has refused to let them go because Hamas want the civilians there as human shields. And it serves Hamas's information war campaign to have as many civilian casualties as possible. Secondly, some civilians are making the case that they've got nowhere to go because none of the border crossings are open. So there is a real challenge here in terms of Israel being able to discriminate between innocent civilians, innocent Palestinian civilians, and Hamas fighters. And the challenge for Israel is to attack Hamas and destroy Hamas, whilst at the same time preserving some sort of possibility of winning the peace by avoiding needless civilian deaths. And that's going to be extremely difficult for the Israelis to manage.
In the latest, we've seen that Houthis have also joined this war. There were fears of a wider regional conflagration. Now we see the Houthis have entered this war as well. What can you tell us of the Houthis' capabilities here?
Look, they have medium-range ballistic missiles. They can strike at Israel, but Israel has a very effective ballistic missile defense systems that can counter those Houthi missiles. The greater danger is not the Houthis. The greater danger is Hezbollah to the north and Iran. I think that I worry less about the Houthis and I worry more about Hezbollah and Iran joining the war because Hezbollah has much greater capacity for bombarding Israel with missiles and rockets than the Houthis could ever dream of. And I think Iran also is a key challenge because that would then bring the United States directly into the conflict.
Speaking of the United States and Jordan, in fact, have agreed that it's critical to ensure that Palestinians are not forcibly displaced outside of Gaza. What sort of measures do you think need to be brought in to ensure this?
It's once again going back to the original question. It's difficult to say because Israel has to defeat Hamas. They can't leave Hamas as an intact fighting force there. They can't leave the Hamas command and control and the leadership intact. So they have to carry on with this war on the ground from the air. But at the same time, there are civilians in the way that are at risk. And ultimately, Gaza is their home. So there has to be a way somehow to essentially discriminate between Hamas on the one hand and the Palestinian civilians on the other, including protecting the interests of the Palestinian civilians, including where they choose to live. They can't be forcibly driven out of Gaza because that's their home.
Right. Dr. Davis, thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast with your insights on this.
Thank you very much.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.